speaks prophetically, you need to weigh the words. You need to ask Holy Spirit to show you what he's trying to say to you. And I guess there's probably some prophets that maybe claim to never make a mistake. I'm not one of those guys. I am certainly capable of getting it wrong or not saying it right or maybe not even hearing right. I do listen with fear and trembling when God speaks to me, and I try to speak to you what he spoke to me. But you need to hear it. You need to weigh it. You need to listen to what Holy Spirit is saying to you today. And especially today, it feels like you need to apply it. Yeah. You need to figure out what it is that God's trying to say to you and sort of where he's trying to take you today, where he's trying to take me. And in Mark chapter 4, Jesus was, in verse 1, Jesus was teaching by the lake. And says the crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake while the people were along the shore at the water's edge. Jesus knew how to, well, I don't know if he knew how, he could attract a crowd. He could, people would listen to Jesus when he spoke. I think Jesus was probably a very gifted communicator. I think he spoke the language that the people understood. He didn't use big words. He didn't use the kind of language that the common people couldn't understand. Jesus' whole ministry was to common people. He literally traveled around the countryside. He didn't go to where the elites or the educated or the, I guess you might even say, the smart people went. He went to people like us. And you, Greg, I'm talking to you. People like you and I, uneducated, ignorant, foolish, and don't know anything. But those were Jesus's people. Those were the people Jesus ministered to. Those were the people that he taught, and so he spoke using a lot of parables, a lot of bowling balls and ping pong balls and picture stories. He would create a picture in somebody's mind, and he was always talking about the kingdom of heaven, and he was always pointing out that there was this big difference between about what was going on in the kingdom of heaven and what was going on here on earth. Kathy, I didn't say welcome to you today. This is Kathy, everybody. She's here with us for the first time. We're so glad you're here. So Jesus knew he knew people gravitated towards him. And this was one of those times when Jesus was teaching. And as he was speaking, more and more people would come. It was an open air type of a place. It wasn't like a planned meeting. It wasn't like there was a flyer put out that said, hey, Jesus is going to be teaching down at the lake at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. If you're not, you need to get there and get a seat. It was one of those deals where as he was teaching, the word would go out. People would actually leave and go get their friends, and they would go get their family. And it probably had something to do with like healing and casting out demons and all the stuff that went with Jesus' teaching. I'm sure people would come to hear him hoping maybe that they would receive healing or maybe see something exciting happen, or maybe it was just the way that he taught was sort of drew people in. And so as he would teach, people would leave and say, hey, you got to come hear this guy teaching down at the lake. And a crowd gathered, and eventually the crowd got so large that they were having a hard time hearing, and so Jesus got in a boat, and they rowed him a little bit out from the shore, and he got away from the people so that they could actually hear him better. And if you've ever been on a body of water, you know that sound really carries across the water. That's true. And so by him moving away from the people, more people could hear him. I know it sounds sort of counterintuitive, but by him going out on the water, the sound would carry and the people could hear him more clearly. So Jesus was preaching to a crowd, and he had people in front of him that needed to hear the gospel. And so he taught all day long. And all through chapter 4, he taught different parables. He taught the people all these different parables. But in the evening, if you go down to verse 35, it says, that day, after teaching all day and after ministering all day and speaking to a crowd, the reason I'm saying that is because Jesus had a church right in front of him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. A large church. Yeah. A church that was had a lot of people in it. And he had a crowd of people that were anxious to hear what he had to say and wanted to hear what Jesus was teaching. But as the day came to a close, Jesus told the disciples, he said, we need to leave here and go to the other side of the lake. Last week God talked to us about the Exodus. Was it last week? Yes. We talked about the Exodus, about leaving. And Jesus did something very curious here. He had a large crowd in front of him, people that wanted to hear what he had to say. But instead of him staying there and teaching the next day and maybe conducting a week of meetings or maybe putting up a little tent or maybe building a tabernacle or some side of a structure where people could come and they could hear him teach, and organizing and handing out badges to all the disciples and appointing deacons and establishing a ministry. Maybe they could start to take an offering every week, and they could build this huge church is how we would do it today. But instead of that, Jesus, after teaching all day and after being well received, Jesus left. It says he told his disciples in verse 35, he says, we need to go to the other side of the lake. So leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And there were some other boats with him. So Jesus left a very successful ministry. He had something successful going on, and he said we need to go to the other side of the lake. And so his whole entourage, if you will, picture this: Jesus in a boat with his disciples, and maybe some of the disciples couldn't get all in the boat, so they got some other boats, and so this whole entourage with Jesus heads out across the lake. And as they're going across the lake, it says a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. So here's Jesus. He left someplace that he was really successful at, and as he's going to the next place where he wants to be, a storm comes up. Now, most of us have been through storms in our life. Some of you have been through storms this week. Some of you are going through a storm right now. You're being. It feels like everything's coming against you. It feels like everything you're trying isn't working. It feels like you're out on the lake. You're all by yourself. The winds are blowing. The waves are high. You can't see the shore. You don't know where you're at, and it feels like your whole life is a storm. Mm-hmm. Some of us have been through those. Some of us are going through them right now. Yeah. And a lot of times we equate those storms and we think, oh, I must be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it would have been real easy for Jesus here for the disciples to assume, well, we should have stayed where we were because we had something good going there. We had something successful happening. Instead, here we are out in the middle of the boat, out in the middle of the lake. We've got all these people with us that we're responsible for now. And here we are out in the middle of the lake, and the boat is floundering. The boat's going to sink. The storm's not letting up. And what are we going to do? And Jesus was asleep in the boat. And so the disciples finally, in desperation, they wake Jesus up, which there's a sermon in there someplace. You wake Jesus up when he's sleeping. I know there's a sermon in there. We're not going to teach it today. But Jesus wakes up and he asks the disciples, he says, what are you guys worried about? What are you fretting about? He said, I know. He said, he didn't say the storm didn't exist. He said this storm is a real thing, but it's not the end of the story. It's not. This storm is going to go away. And so he stood up and he said, to the wind and the waves, he said, you all need to be quiet. And as soon as he spoke the word, everything quieted down and calmed down. And Jesus said, why are you so afraid? He said, don't you have any faith? And I want to point out to us that we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that the storms in our life are indicators that we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that we're going the wrong direction. And the truth is, and I'm going to speak to this in a few minutes, the truth is a lot of times the storms are not telling you you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're actually an indicator that you're in the right place at the right time. That you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. So Jesus leaves a successful church. He leaves a growing ministry. He leaves something that seems to be working really well for him. He gets into a boat, goes through this awful storm, and he tells his disciples, in the middle of the storm, you just need to be still. You need to be calm. You need to trust me. And what God showed me this week is that we are going to go through some storms. It's part of what's coming. There's going to be things happen to us that seem like they're going to drown us. It feels like we're not going to survive this day. We're not going to get to the other side of the lake. But in that storm, the secret, the way to get through the storm is to be calm. The disciples were doing everything they could to fight the storm. They were rowing the boat. They were bailing the water out of the boat with whatever means they had. They were trying their best to get to the other side of the lake. And Jesus stood up and said, y'all just need to be still for a minute. And if you're going through a storm today, if there's things in your life right now that you're doubtful about, that you are worried are going to swamp you, that are going to drown you, the message today is you need to be still. Just be still. Calm down and find the still place inside you. Yes. Because that's where you'll find Jesus. They found Jesus in the storm, but they found him in the stillness, in the calmness. Be still and know he is God. I know it's counterintuitive. I know it goes against our nature. It goes against everything we think. We think, oh no, there's a storm. There's an attack. Somebody's trying to stop me from where I want to go. And our instinct is to rise up and fight against it and scream and holler and make all kind of noise and get engaged in all kinds of activity. We start running around in circles. And God is saying to us today, you need to learn to be still. You need to learn to be calm. Why? Because Jesus is in the boat, in the storm with you all the time. He's not going to let you drown. Jesus, even though he had left someplace where he was successful, he was on his way to do something else. And on his way, he encountered the storm. So after the storm comes up and Jesus calms the boat, calms the storm, and teaches the disciples, you need to be still in the storm. You need to be calm. They get to the other side of the lake. In Mark chapter 5, they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus got out of the boat...
Chapter 4. He began to teach again by the sea, and such a very large crowd gathered to him.
Sorry.
He sat down. He was teaching them many things in parables.
Stopping.
He said to them in his teaching, listen to this. Behold, the sower went to sow. As he was sowing, some seed.
Okay, sorry.
That's the second sermon.
Good. That's a good transition, because actually we're shifting gears a little bit, because now Jesus has gotten to the other side. He's got to the other side of the lake, and this is where God was speaking to me, and I tried to get away from this message all week long. God gave me this on Sunday, and this story is actually told in all three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when I read the story, and I was in Matthew on Sunday, and as I was reading it, and God started to speak to it, I wasn't comfortable with it, and so I tried to get away from it. I said, God, okay, that's a good word for me, and I'll receive it, and I'll put it in there, but I'm gonna keep moving because surely this isn't what you want me to speak on Saturday. And I actually tried to get away from it, and I did for a day or two. But then when I got into Mark, here's this story again, and so God spoke the same thing to me when I read this story in Mark that I read in Matthew, and what he gave me was a prophetic picture of what's going to happen in our world in the next couple years. And so Jesus gets to the other side after leaving someplace that was really successful and something that seemed to be working really well, where people were being saved, where converts were being added to the church. Jesus left there, and when he gets to the other side, after going through a storm, after fighting through a storm, it seems like everything was indicating that Jesus was going the wrong way, that he was headed the wrong direction. And as soon as Jesus got out of the boat in Mark chapter 5, a man in the story in Matthew, it actually says two men, so it might have been two men, but there was only a man or two, got out. When Jesus got out of the boat, immediately Jesus was approached by a man or a couple men with an impure spirit. And where the boat landed was in a desolate place. It was in a place where nobody went. It was called a place of the tombs. It was a cemetery or a graveyard. It was a place where they used to bury people. And back then, they didn't dig holes and bury people in the ground. They found a cave or a hole, and they would inter the bodies in there, and then they would slide a rock or something across the face of the tomb, and then the next time somebody would die, they would roll the stone away, and they would put another body in there. And so it was a place where nobody went. You didn't go there to have a picnic. Number one, it smelled horrible. Because it was a cemetery, and it wasn't an underground cemetery. It was decaying bodies, and so it was a place where nobody wanted to be. Except that's where these two men, this is where this man was living. When he came out of the tombs, he came out of this area, and he approached Jesus. It says this man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. We're living in a time when the impure spirits are getting out of control.
Yes.
We're seeing it. We're seeing in our lifetime. We're seeing over the last. It seems like even over the last 5 years or so, we're seeing a marked increase in demonic activity. Now we don't call it demonic activity. They call it something else. Every time somebody has a problem, an emotional disorder or a mental disorder, we slap some letters of the alphabet on it, and we call it something, and we label it something, and then the pharmaceutical company comes out with a drug that has a name that you can barely pronounce, it doesn't make any sense, and says, here, if you take this drug, it'll sedate you enough that you won't be affected by this demonic activity. Most of the mental disorders and most of the emotional disorders that we're seeing happen right in our society, in our culture, are a direct result of the liar letting his minions loose, and it's infecting our society. This man This man had been controlled by an impure spirit or a demonic spirit for years, and he kept getting worse and worse. At first, they could control him. Yeah. They could bind him. They could keep him sort of under lock and key, but the longer things went, the more out of control he got. Yeah. And finally, it got to a point where they could no longer control him. They could no longer tie him up. They try to bind him with ropes or chains or handcuffs or leg irons or something, but he was under the control of Satan and under the control of this demonic spirit, and he got so strong that he could no longer be contained. And so what they did was they just would go around the area where he lived. And this poor man lived in the tombs, and he lived in the cemetery, and it says night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. And he would torture himself, and he would rip off his clothes, and he would screech and holler, and it was such a foul, evil thing that the people, instead of fighting to contain it anymore, they just said, you know what? We're just going to leave that area, and whenever the people needed to pass by that area, they would always go around it. They just abandoned him to whatever demonic spirit was what had him under control. And what God is speaking to me, and what he's saying is that we are coming into a time when this is going to happen more and more and more. We are going to see more and more demonic activity. We're going to call it something else. We're going to call it ADHD or ADD or some other, we'll slap some letters of the alphabet, or we'll call it a name, and we'll say, well, this person deals with it's just an emotional disorder. But what's going to happen is more and more, this demonic activity is going to take control, and it's going to get out of hand. So Jesus was approached by this man that was controlled by an impure spirit. It says when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. So the man sees Jesus, and I don't know if he had a moment of clarity. I don't know if he saw through the demonic haze that had controlled him for so long, but the man saw Jesus, and so the man approached Jesus. And as the man approached Jesus, there was an immediate conflict between Jesus and the demonic force that was in control of him. And as the man approached Jesus, and he fell down on his face in front of Jesus, Jesus addressed the demon and said, "You have got to go." It says, when he saw Jesus from a distance, verse 6, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So Jesus addressed the demonic spirit in this man. And he said, "You have got to leave this man alone." And the spirit, when he realized who Jesus was, and by the way, the spirit recognized Jesus. Jesus spoke with authority. The demon itself recognized the authority in Jesus and immediately began to try to negotiate with Jesus. There wasn't a screaming or a hollering. There wasn't a wrestling match between Jesus and the demon. The demon didn't accuse Jesus of being something he wasn't. The demon immediately recognized the authority that Jesus represented.
Paul, my New King James says he worshipped him, but who?
Yeah.
Is the he, the demon or the man?
Yeah, he worshipped Jesus, probably the man.
Yeah.
But the demon also recognized who Jesus was. Here's the thing. Remember, Jesus had just come through the storm with his disciples. And in that storm, what the disciples learned, if you go back and read in Mark chapter 4, when Jesus calmed the storm, remember the disciples' reaction right at the end of that chapter? The disciples said, "Who is this that even the wind and rain have the authority to tell us what to do?" See, you've been fighting against the storm. You've been fighting against all the things that you think, oh, I'm being swamped. I'm being attacked all the time. And why are all these bad things happening to me? And what God is trying to teach you is he's trying to teach you the level of authority that you actually operate in. Because when you get to the other side of the lake, you're going to face some demonic activity that you're going to need to take authority in the name of Jesus to cast those demons out. I've never been involved in what you would call a deliverance ministry. I know there have been ministries that they specialize in deliverance, and they sort of that's their area of special ministry. And I'm not telling you that we need to start a deliverance ministry. But what God is telling us today is that we are going to need to learn to walk in our authority, because the enemy that we're facing is not an enemy of flesh and blood.
Yes.
It's not the enemy of poor health. It's a demonic spirit. And we are going to see a rise in this demonic activity. So Jesus addressed the demonic spirit, and he said, you have to leave this man. And when Jesus spoke to the demonic spirit recognized the authority, and then Jesus asked the demonic spirit, he said, what is your name? He said, my name is Legion. He replied, for we are many. And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. The demons were begging for their very existence here. They said, Jesus, it's not time for us yet to be destroyed. And so they begged Jesus not to send them out of the area. He begged them not to destroy him. And the demons pointed out, they said, look, over there on the hillside, there's a large herd of pigs. And sure enough, over on the hillside, a large herd of pigs was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus, send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them. Now here's what God spoke to me, and I you need to understand this. In the Jewish culture, pigs were evil, vile, disgusting creatures. Remember the Old Testament law? When Moses got the law, one of the things that God told him is you're not allowed, there were certain animals that you weren't allowed to eat. Pigs was right at the top of the list. Sorry for you Jews, you get no bacon. No ham, no pork. And so, in fact, they were so vile and so disgusting that they weren't even allowed to touch those animals. Pigs had no place in the Jewish culture. They were a picture, if you will, of a vile, disgusting, evil thing. And as I was reading this story, God pointed. I always wondered when I read this story, what was there a herd of pigs in Judea for? Where did these pigs come from? They said there was 2,000 of them. That's a large herd of pigs. And I always wondered, why were there even pigs there? And as I was reading this story this week, God said it's because the nation of Israel had fallen into, they had backslidden for so long that they had learned and allowed pigs to live with them. even though they weren't allowed to eat them, and even though they weren't allowed to touch them, they weren't allowed to any contact with them, but they had allowed, because of their backslidden condition, they had allowed this herd of pigs to live with them. And what God told me is that in our culture, in our society, in the world that we live in right now, we have allowed pigs to live beside us.
Yes.
Vile, evil, disgusting, dirty. And what these pigs represented was the evil that exists in our world today, in our country. And it lives right next door to us. Now, I'm not saying that to God didn't tell me this in a way of like, oh, you should get rid of these pigs. He just pointed out to me that because of generations of sort of neglecting God and walking away from God, we now live in a world that the pigs live right next to us. Evil is operating in our world all the time. And it's partly because we've allowed it. We've allowed it to function. We've allowed it to get a toehold. And in this particular place, there was a herd of 2,000 pigs, and the Jewish people, had learned to live beside this evilness, this vileness. And so when Jesus cast out the demons, and as Jesus cast out this impure spirit, the impure spirit said, hey, let us go into the pigs. Now follow this, because this is what God was telling me. He said what's going to happen is we are going to see more and more demonic activity. And we, as God's chosen people, are going to need to step up to the plate and address this demonic activity. We are going to need to start casting out demons out of people. Impure spirits. I'll tell you something else. You notice when the man approached Jesus, Jesus never asked the man. He never said, how did this spirit get into you? How did this all come about? There was no teaching on that. There was no explanation. There was no condemnation from Jesus to the man. See, that's what we do in the church. First thing we do whenever we come up against some kind of demonic activity, right away we want to get into the person's business. And we want to condemn them, and we want to get them all straightened out. And we tell them, boy, if you could just jump through enough of our Christian hoops, and if you could join our church, and if you could clean up your act, and if you could do enough things right, then we'll address this demonic spirit. Jesus never addressed it with the man. He never went back and said, how did this demon get into your life? Instead, he told the demonic spirit, you got to go. Now, when the demonic spirit came out, it's, I think, really cool that Jesus sent the demonic spirit into the pigs. The evil, the vile, the disgusting. Most of you know the story. What happened when the evil spirit hit the pigs? 2,000 pigs committed mass suicide. It says when the spirits hit the pigs, and it must have been a member of the spirit identifying himself as being legion. He said, we are many. So there must have been, imagine this poor man, he had over 2,000 spirits living in him. Because when those 2,000 spirits hit the pigs, all the pigs who were just probably sitting around, they all jumped up and they all ran into the sea and drowned. And here's what the Holy Spirit was speaking to me. He said, as we, as God's people, learn, and as we step into our authority and take authority over the demonic activity that's taking place in our world, the demons are going to have to go somewhere. And he said where they're going to go is into the evil that is operating in our world. And when those demons hit that evil is going to tear itself apart.
Oh, wow.
Remember, Jesus cast out the demon. The demon went into the pigs, which the pigs never should have been there. They were a vile, disgusting, evil presence. And as soon as the demons hit the pigs, they destroyed themselves. Now, right now, we're getting all excited because we're thinking, all right, we're going to have victory. We're going to see people delivered from these demons. The demons are going to go into the evil, and then the evil is going to destroy itself, and we're going to be left standing all alone on the top of the mountain. Because that would be the natural assumption. That this was a great victory for Jesus, and that Jesus, he left one ministry, and now it's starting to make sense. Yeah, he left the big church that he was pastoring, and he moved all the way across the lake and fought the storms and got through all that. Now, with all of this evil being destroyed and the pigs being destroyed and this man being delivered, now we can build an even bigger church on this side of the lake. Because surely, when the word gets out that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is operating in this area, and he's casting out demons, and he's shutting down the bars, and he's shutting down the houses of prostitution, and the drug dealers are killing themselves, and all of the evil in the area is imploding on itself, and all the politicians in Washington D.C. are eating themselves alive, and all of this sin and the evil in the world, they're all fighting against each other. By the way, that's going to happen. We're going to see that happen more and more. We're already starting to see it. We're already starting to see. You ever watch how when people that are controlled by Satan, they attack each other.
Yeah.
And they will eat themselves. They will destroy themselves. We're going to see that happen more and more. But here's the interesting part. After all this happened, and after the pigs destroyed themselves, it says those tending the pigs in verse 14 ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened. Sounds like a revival, right? Sounds like there's going to be this huge mass number of people coming to Jesus and falling down on their face before him and saying, what do we need to do to be saved? And boy, we're so thankful that you got here. I mean, we've lived with this demonic spirit in our tomb here. We couldn't even go in that area, and now the pigs are gone. Boy, you're just cleaning everything up. Surely there's going to be a great revival. So they came to Jesus, the people from the community. They came out and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told the people what happened to the demon-possessed man. So they reported the incident. They told the people came out. Here's this man that for years had terrorized this entire area, out of control. He's sitting and talking with Jesus and his disciples, and is in his right mind. He's perfectly whole. The people told the people that had witnessed it, the pig herders told the people, and they told them about the pigs. And it says in verse 17, probably one of the saddest verses in the Bible. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Now here's why I didn't want to preach this today. Now listen, every one of us in this room have the authority to tell demons, you got to go. Not just me, not just the preacher, not just the professional church builders. Every Christian on the planet had, if you are a child of God, and if you are under the blood of Jesus, you need to understand the authority that you operate under. Because I have the authority, and we need to start exercising that authority against the demonic influences that are coming into our world today. But understand something. The world is not necessarily going to be happy with you. These people, after seeing this miracle, and after seeing this victory, and after seeing evil destroyed and wiped out of their region, after seeing all of that, they told Jesus, we need you to leave. We are coming into a different time than anything we've ever lived before. Most of my life, I've been taught, and I've sort of been led to believe that we need to build bigger churches. We need to increase and use more technology in our ministries. We need to have special lights and special music, and we need to build big sanctuaries where we can get thousands of people to hear the gospel. And we need to use all of the technology that's available to us, the internet and all of the social media platforms. And we need to build these big ministries. We need to build a big name for ourselves, because that's how we're going to win the world. And so that's what we've done my whole life. I've watched these big mega churches get built. And by the way, I'm not preaching against big churches. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. But what I'm saying is they're not doing the job. Because while all of these big churches have been being built, and we've built these really nice churches, and we have these great big ministries, and thousands of people come to them, and yet the world is still controlled by all this demonic activity. It's you and I that need to learn to walk in the authority that God has given us. And we might need to come out from the shadow of those big ministries, and we might need to address the demons that are operating on a one-on-one basis. Jesus left a place where he was preaching to thousands to come, and he brought his whole entourage with him. And they fought through the storm, and they dealt with all that stuff so that he could talk to this one man. Because when the people asked Jesus to leave, he left. So Jesus left one side of the lake where he was preaching to thousands and having hundreds of converts. He left all that to come all the way across the lake to reach one man. And the world, when they saw this whole thing, they said, we need you to leave. We need you to leave. According to the scripture, Jesus left. He got back in his boat, went back across. He never even traveled into the countryside. Never preached a sermon there. As far as we know, this was the only man that he spoke to while he was there. When they came and asked him to leave, Jesus got back in the boat, and as he left, the man who had been possessed, the man who had been set free, begged Jesus, he said, let me go with you. let me go with you. And Jesus said, no. He said, you need to stay here because you need to go through all of the towns around here and you need to tell people your story. You need to tell people what happened to you. But as far as we know, Jesus never came back to this area. Jesus never again came to that part of the country, came to on that side of the lake. I told you, I wrestled with this all week. And I kept, usually when God gives me a word, there's like a conclusion to it. There's like I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it all kind of comes together for me. It all sort of makes sense. This week it didn't come like that. This week I wrestled with it all week.